Welcome back to the 20th episode of Oppidan's Heads and Tails podcast. And in this episode, we're delighted. I am delighted personally to be joined by a friend and I'd say one of the world's leading experts on. I'm going to start again on that. Okay. Welcome back to the 20th episode of Oppidan's Head and Tails podcast. On this episode, we're delighted to be joined by Sharath Jeevan. Sharath is, interests on the table, a great friend. He is also one of the world's leading experts on navigating our inflection moments. His groundbreaking book, Intrinsic, has received, I would say, glowing endorsements from smart thinking writers across the world, to education leaders, to, I believe, the former Prime Minister of Greece. Awarded an OBE in 2022 for founding and leading STIR Education, which is arguably the world's largest intrinsic motivation initiative, working with over 200,000 teachers, 35,000 schools, and I think on last glance, over 7 million children in emerging countries. So Sharath is, I would say, a world expert on all things motivation. We're going to come to that in our podcast. Closer to home, Sharath is the executive chairman of Intrinsic Labs, which supports organizations, leaders around the world to navigate their own inflection moments. And in this episode, we're going to be looking particularly at inflection moments within education. So Sharath, thank you for joining us on Heads and Tails.
Thanks, Walter. What a pleasure, and what a pleasure it's been to see you and Oppidan on the journey. And yeah, really excited to be part of the conversation today.
Great. Just on a personal note, when a bio like that is read out, what bits of that really gets you going? What bits do you feel most proud of?
I feel a bit cringeworthy, actually, to be honest. But it's no, I think for me, I started my career in education in terms of really being a social entrepreneur, Walter, as well as you said. It's a passion. It's a cause that is deeply dear to my heart. Probably about 20% of the work I do is in education per se. I really help leaders, as you said, across all sectors navigate inflection moments in this very choppy world we're in right now. But I think that I really believe education is transformational. It's the key to unlocking so many of the issues around the generational divide we see today, around unlocking the potential of young people, of course. And I think the role of teachers and school leaders of all kinds is absolutely pivotal to that. So yeah, I think the education part is always something that I'm always reminded of the centrality of that issue.
I suppose going back in a linear manner, what was the catalyst in working in the fields that you have decided to work on? Was there a kind of formative moment as a child? Was there a mentor of yours who inspired you to work in this field? What was that kind of catalyst for you?
Yeah, so I think, I think about this idea that not all time, and especially not all leadership time, is created equal, Walter, as well at the core. I do think we're at a really, really important stage in the world and in education, actually, where what we do over the coming years is going to be so pivotal. I think we have the choice to play safe, to do what is already done, go with what our regulators, Ofsted, etc., want us to do, and continue to work in this very bureaucratic, system that isn't really, I don't think, doing the right thing for every child. Or as leaders, we can try to be a little bit more pirate, be more like rebels with a cause, and branch out. We have actually quite a lot of freedom. We've built platforms that allow us to take some risks. And for me, I think that narrative is one I've struggled with personally. I'm the son of immigrant parents in this country. The narrative I grew up with was very much about playing by the rules, right? That there were certain rules, a certain system. There was an escalator model of success. And if I played, so I went to Cambridge, I joined a consulting firm. I did all the things that I was supposed to do to get on this escalator, and I was going up the escalator, right? I mean, it was clear, we have a very meritocratic system in that sense in the UK. But I realized the escalator wasn't, it was going to land several buildings short of where we actually need to get to really create a better world for us all. It would have led to a very comfortable life. It would maybe, respectable in many senses, but I think it wasn't really going to do what's right for the next generation. And I think that's the fundamental disconnect I've grappled with as a leader. I think that's the disconnect that everyone working in education today, I would argue, is a central question. To what extent do we accept these rules and play by them, or to what extent do we start to be a little bit subversive and rebellious and and try and change them, starting initially where we have autonomy and control, but also, most of us have a strong voice, a strong influence, also in building that better system for us all as well.
Let's hold that tension just there. And we're going to come back to the kind of pirate element of leadership that I know is kind of central to your third book called Inheritable. But just sliding back a little, you talked about the word autonomy there. That word is one of three, I believe, central cogs to your whole theory on intrinsic motivation, which I know was the central element of your work on STIR education. So for the layman out there, including me, could you explain to us what you mean by intrinsic motivation, perhaps within the context of STIR, and then how you can apply that to your own work today?
Yeah, and of course, I know you're very well versed in this area, Walter, as well. But I think on the idea of intrinsic motivation, if you think of how we've set up our school systems, they've been primarily driven by external or extrinsic incentives and rewards, right? It's grades, it's getting into the right schools, the right universities, and so on. There is room for that, for sure. We need some level of that. There is some, I think we have, for example, really improved the variability and quality in the UK, right? At the sort of, we had a lot of variation before. I think some of these measures have been successful in that. We should definitely celebrate that. But I think we're at a point now where we need to move the dial more inwards. That's the kind of basic idea of intrinsic motivation. And how do we try and do this in a way that builds three pillars, as you said? One is around autonomy, and this idea of really being at the wheel of our professional lives, being able to influence things and take control and build things for the better in our classrooms, our schools, and the system. The second area is really around purpose, and that sense of helping and serving others each day is what I call small p purpose. But there's a bigger P, the kind of capital P purpose, which is about how do we contribute to collectively to a better education system for us all. So there's the two aspects of purpose, and then the element of mastery. How do we get better and better in what we do as professionals? And that's where I think if we can really embed those principles of purpose, autonomy, and mastery into education systems, we're going to get much better, much more fertile soil to plant seeds into later. That was the work I did at STIR Education, to your question. It was we were trying to build that into about 35,000 schools in countries like India, parts of East Africa, Indonesia, Brazil, etc. As well. But yeah, I think that kind of core idea of ultimately what do we want our children to be driven by, or young people? Do we want them only to be driven by the rewards, the external successes, and so on, or do we want them to deeply love learning and be lifelong learners? That's one of the central questions on this. And I think we as a profession in education have got to think about that dial and where we want to move it to.
The critics of that theory would say that it's all well and good giving kids autonomy and focusing on purpose, but there are just certain circumstances, certain home truths that mean that children need to focus on these hygiene factors. They need to pass exams, they need to jump through the hoops because that's going to serve them best. And that, I think, has become most clear in the kind of skills versus knowledge debate, and then more recently in the debate over the continuation or abolishment of GCSEs and the way that ties into perhaps debilitating social mobility. How do you respond to the critics who say, Sharath, this is all nice and good, but come on, we've got to make sure the kids pass exams?
Yeah, so what's really interesting, I work now with the worlds of education and employment, and one of my clients is Adecco, one of the world's biggest staffing groups, and they put, I think, 500,000 people into jobs every day, if I remember the stats right. But what's really interesting is I've never come across an employer on the other side of my work who's delighted by the education system as it stands. They want change. They want actually radical change. They want us to be more pirate, inside the education system. And yet we speak as if, there was some kind of constraint there. I think employees are chomping at the bit to want to reform this. But I think what we need to create is a better dialogue and work together with, between ourselves in education and the world of employment to look at what we really need as well. But I was in Switzerland last week and talking to a major foundation. I won't name them, but a major foundation. We were talking about young people and what sort of young workers. And I asked them, what's the key thing you would love to see more of? And it wasn't anything to do with academic grades or content or knowledge. These are important. We know we need, of course, a high degree of subject knowledge. We need to link knowledge and skills, but they were talking about self-drive, the ability to also sort of be thrown into something that they've never come across before and find their way through. They talked about the need to observe well and look around at a culture around them and be able to decode that so they understand sort of how behavior works in that particular system. They talked about taking self-initiative a lot more and also being able to stay present through tougher times. The last thing they talked about was how young professionals need to develop mastery themselves rather than always go through, assume the best examples of structured course, right? How do they use mentors and managers around them? None of that had anything to do with these old debates, right? I think that's where I think employers are feeling the most pain. And I think it's a huge win-win to build a bridge between these two worlds.
Yeah, again, I am cards on the table. We developed Sharath's intrinsic motivation theory within our work externally with young people and actually internally in the office. And those three pillars, autonomy, mastery, and purpose, are just excellent at helping to create a culture which is really the subject of your third book, which is called Inheritable, and I believe you're writing it live on LinkedIn, which is a novel way of subscribing to writing. Tell me if I'm wrong. You talk about being at an inflection moment, perhaps, where we need to see the role of leaders as different, with and of that, central to that being aware of the core responsibility that we have. Perhaps one area of the book I'd like to talk about is you talk about the generational divide and the challenges that gives leaders. How can leaders in businesses that have a generational divide overcome those challenges, do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm writing this book as I go along, Walter, as well. So please, if anyone's watching and interested, please follow me, connect with me on LinkedIn, and please, I love your ideas. I'm writing this. I think we've got to do so many things differently in the world. I think writing is one of them. I think the days of an author having all the answers, and I think it's long gone. I really want to build this with great minds and get views. And I'd love to interview members of the Optum community as well, who might be interested or have a point of view on this topic. But yeah, I sort of feel like that question, and if I look at myself, right, I'm 47. I've been successful in many conventional, ways. I've been to sort of top universities, got an OBE, all that stuff. But if I ask myself that honest question of have I done the most I could for this next generation, as a leader, perhaps as a parent, but also as a citizen, I've got to be honest, I can't say yes, right, to that question. And so for me, it was a lot of introspection of what do I need to change myself as a leader to enable that to happen. And I think part of it is to just not accept as much crap as we've been willing to accept. I think I sort of felt, perhaps it's an immigrant thing, that I came into this country, from India. It was not my, country I was born in. Perhaps there was a sense of being grateful, of being given the keys to lots of things, because of these fancy badges and so on. I'm grateful for that. I think the UK should be, and many countries should be very, I think, proud of that. That sense. We have a British Asian Prime Minister, right? Respecting political views, that's an amazing achievement. But I think the sort of head boy or head girl syndrome, where we just take the keys and feel grateful for that and do what we're told, I think we've got to move away from that. And I think we've got to really start to step back and question, what is our role here? What's the core problem at hand? And if I look at the world of education, there's such a big disconnect with how we're preparing young people, and all the great work that you do, Walter, is testament to that. You supplant what we do in the education system, but only, a relatively small number of young people can benefit from that. So I know both of us are passionate about how can we bring that into the core of the system so we prepare young people much better. That means we've got to shift how we practice and behave. We've got to nurture young people differently. And we've also got to stand up to some of the structures around us, not in some confrontation for confrontation's sake way, but really start to make the case for why we need to see change. And so I think I be honest, I think myself, maybe my generation is something of a half leadership generation. We've led, yes, but we've taken a lot of stuff from, dictates from the past. And I think we need to really step back and question all these things. And that's kind of the core idea of the book. And I love thoughts and ideas on it as I go.
God, it's fascinating. How in principle might that apply to a 26-year-old teacher, recently promoted head of department at a London state secondary, who's read your book? I'm thinking of certain people I know who will want to make these changes, but maybe may have a ceiling to more traditional ways of doing things. What's your advice to him or her on how they can enact greater responsibility as a leader?
So one of the things, let me give a real example. Actually, so I've been working with a wonderful group called Reach Academy. They're based in Reach Foundation, based in Feltham. I'm sure you know them well, and Ed and the team and James Townsend are remarkable leaders. And so what I've been given the real privilege to do is to work with a group of very senior leaders across many multi-academy trusts across the southwest of England. And the question we're working on together in this program is, what's the next mountain we've got to climb? Right, first of all, let's define it. It's very easy, especially in that sort of deputy CEO role, to sort of say, okay, my job is to get to CEO, either in my existing trust or somewhere else, and that's all it's about. What we've been doing is taking the space away and saying, actually, let's really focus on how do I see the world, and what's my perspective on the problem? And I think a lot of times what's happened with my generation is we've seen leadership as a title, and not as the power of leadership coming from seeing the world differently. So we worked a lot with those leaders on how do they see the education world differently? How do they see the problems? They're in the southwest of England, and it's actually one of the most disadvantaged areas in the country. I hadn't realized that before starting working with them. So we're looking at sort of what are the real challenges then, and how do they see that? Once that perspective is clear, how do they set a direction for themselves and for the trust that really will take and address that issue? Then we can look at how do we nurture team potential towards it, get the right motivational culture in, all of those elements. But the first starting point, I'd say to and to use that example, the 26-year-old head of department, step back and say, look, what are you seeing in your young people? What's going well, but more importantly, what are the challenges? How do you see things differently from others? Don't just try and conform. And based on that, what can you do as a leader to shift that? And there are lots of things, right, that can be done.
I want to we're going to finish the interview with 3 quick questions. One of them is around fatherhood, and you talked about fancy badges, which I think is a nice way to kind of segue into that. There is a culture of achievement in feats and short-term wins, and it's one thing working with a business to change the culture. It's another thing working with a child, a son or a daughter. How do you, and this is going into parenting advice for those parents who are listening, how do you with your own family try to move sentiment away from short-term fancy badges? Or rather, do you sometimes get caught up in them yourself?
Yeah, so definitely get caught up from time to time for sure, Walter. So all of us are human. My kids have actually benefited a lot from some of the stuff you guys have provided over the years as well, because I think it's a really nourishing space for them to do. But yeah, I think the key thing is to really, I think, value them for who they are, help them find themselves, give them that space. It's the equivalent. It's almost leadership parenting. I sort of see parenting as a form of leadership development, really. Can we give them space to figure out where they want to make a unique contribution to the world? What I'm very worried about with our current generation of kids and young people is the degree to which, because we're spoon feeding so much, we're running so many inputs into parenting, especially those from middle and upper middle class backgrounds. It can give an outsized sense of importance to young people about the centrality of their lives, actually, when I think we need to flip it and help them see, real purpose and leadership coming from helping others, and them almost dissolving away. They sort of lose that self-consciousness, that imposter syndrome stuff that so many young people feel today. How can they feel a sense of something bigger, and how can they see they can contribute towards that? So wherever possible, it's not easy, I've got to say, especially in in London, where it's a competitive world in many ways as well. Trying to bring that message to our kids quite strongly, so they see that bigger picture, realize that they're very privileged for sure, but also help them understand and find things they're passionate about that will help others at the same time, and trying to keep sensible boundaries about we will help them when they're lucky, but we're also going to put some, back to autonomy, some guardrails around how much we will support them. We want them to struggle. We want them to screw up sometimes. We want them to realize that failure is part of life as well. So that bigger purpose and that idea of a failure and almost not doing as much as you possibly could to support them. I think those are two really important principles I'm trying to develop as a parent.
Fantastic. Well, we are at an inflection point, and the challenge is so exciting, and I think you're doing God's work in making change there. You have answered the first half of my first question, but to put you on the spot then, Sharath, and I haven't given you these questions in advance, so no apologies for that. Can you give me can you give me an example of a pirate parenting tip? How can a parent be more pirate?
So my son, I was in Zurich with my wife for the weekend. My parents are incredibly generous. They often will look after the kids once in a while. So that my mum, they live about 30-40 minutes away from where we live. My mum was driving the boys yesterday to school, and they got late, right? And my older son, who is always obsessed by being perfect, right? In that sense, he wants to be punctual all the time. And he was getting very frustrated in the car. So we had a discussion afterwards yesterday when I got back, saying, look, let's look at a big picture. You're very reliable, and something I know that's very important to you as a value. I'm very proud of that. But sometimes there's a greater good, right? And your grandmother was driving you. Do you really want her to feel stressed? It's okay once in a while to be late. We all do it occasionally, as long as we don't make it a habit. So let's think about that bigger picture as well. So that's a very practical example from yesterday that we had a conversation over with last night.
Nice, lovely. You're writing your third book. You will have time to read yourself. Your book recommendation, please.
So I'm going to be very embarrassed because I'm going to forget the name of the one second. I'm just going to, because there's one book I think is really, hang on a second, if I can find it. Yeah, it's the author is called Jennifer Brandy Wallace. She's in the US, and her book is called Never Enough. And I think what was so interesting, I've been sort of chatting to her on LinkedIn and so on, is that the book is all about this idea of our success and achievement culture has taken over our parenting. And as a result, kids feel, she has some very compelling data in the book showing that, often a lot of kids feel they have no value beyond their grades. And one of the best signals of that is just how we spend our time. So at the dinner table, if all the conversation is about homework, grades, what extracurricular activities, all of that stuff, then it signals a lot. And so one of the ideas is to, yes, those things are important, but not to link the value of the child or young person to that stuff. These things are two independent things. We want them to do well, but we see them, whatever happens on that front, we will always care and admire them and see them as real people who deserve time and attention. Highly recommended. It's called Never Enough.
Never Enough. Fantastic. We talk about progress conversations. Just avoid progress conversations around the dinner table. It's a signal that is often unpopular with children. Finally, Sharath, your hero. Who do you look up to?
Do I have a hero? I've got to say, Walter, I'm sort of I don't know. I think it's looking forward to previous generations of leaders we've had. The fewer and fewer. I think that I really admire your and Henry's story. I think because I think you've shown that two young people pretty much out of university. I know a couple of years out, but have managed to create something, build something from nothing. Help many young people now around the world reach places they wouldn't have reached otherwise. To me, it's a real strong optimism. When I talk to my kids, I talk about you guys as an example of, going for it, believing in something. I know there's been some bumps. It's been a pleasure working with you on the journey, but the idea that it's really important to feel connected to something bigger than ourselves. And I think, I think you're a really great example of that move as well.
That's very kind indeed. We're going to finish there. We're out of time. Your book, Inheritable, when is that out? When can
So I've got to say that the second book, Inflection, is out in January. So please, that's all about this idea of leaders and how to navigate these really important inflection moments in education, but also well beyond. I'm writing the third book right now on LinkedIn. So just easiest way is just follow or connect with me on LinkedIn, Sharath Jeevan, and I'd love to just most importantly just involve you in the conversation. I think these are such important topics, and I think the voices of educators are absolutely critical to really getting this generational transfer to work well.
Wonderful. I'm personally motivated more intrinsically than I was 30 minutes ago. Sharath, thank you for joining us on Heads and Tails. Have a lovely morning.
Thanks, Walter.